Hello and welcome to the Rooted Leadership Podcast. Today we have an amazing guest, David Whippy. He's an assistant professor out at Brigham Young University, Hawaii. He teaches an incredible basket of classes from intercultural peace building to intercultural mediation, NGOs, conflict resolution, peace ecology, restorative justice, peace education. He has an immense amount of experience working with students and people from all over the globe. He's done peace building in the Pacific. From his Fijian roots, he integrates a lot of incredible indigenous practices into his work. David is a pleasure. Him and I have been friends for many, many years. Currently, not only is he a professor, but he is the director of the David O. McKay Center for Intercultural Understanding out in Hawaii, where they work on peace building initiatives all over and help students get the knowledge and the experience necessary to go out and be practitioners. So David is amazing. We're going to get to know him a lot more on this episode, but I wanted to give a more formal introduction just to the incredible person that he is. So thankful that he could be on our show. We're grateful for you tuning in. Please enjoy. Aloha and mahalo, my friend. Appreciate you. You know, we've been doing this show for, I think we started 2020, so it's been a few years now. And it was meant for our leaders in our community, but it's kind of spread since then. And so Rooted Leadership Podcast, we're not just talking about leadership, we're really talking about culture and dynamics and all the things that leaders might touch in their families, their communities, their organizations, which is a lot, really. So we've had some cool guests throughout our history, some authors and thought leaders, community leaders, high school kids. So David, thanks for joining again. Mahalo a little bit to any viewers or listeners. David and I go quite a ways back. We went to school together in Hawaii. I think we first met in 2009, would have been the first year, I think, or maybe were you there? Yeah. Was it 2009 or was it like 2012? I can't remember.
I think it was close around that time. I think I was about to leave, I think, and you came on as I think you were field director after our group, right?
Yeah, and I joined you had a project, and I joined your senior project, I think. So you were quite the athlete yourself as well. Fijian national team, right? Basketball.
That was a long time. It was about 15 years ago, and about 50 pounds ago also.
Hey, look, I still think it's incredible, man. One of my regrets in life is I never got a hoop with you. So
do it. You gotta do it sometime.
We have to make that happen sometime. Even though we're old men, we can still do it.
I agree.
But that's pretty cool. And I know your family has a rich history in Fijian basketball and have done some pretty cool things. So brothers, your dad as well, correct? And any sisters in as well that have played?
Yeah. So you know, my cousin Marcus played here at BYU, and I have both of my sisters played at Long Island University at the collegiate level there. Represented the country, and so it's been very much a family sport, and so family reunions are crazy.
Yeah,
1-on-1 and 3-on-3 kind of thing, you know.
Yeah, I think that's a fun fact to know about you as well. David, I'll say a little bit more in a second. Still, he's there. He's a professor there and running the peace building program, the McKay Center out there, which is something very near and dear to me. But that's where we first met, and we've gone on our paths, and we've gotten education and all sorts of things, and we've stayed close to the idea of peace building and having an impact and influence for good in the world because of McKay's vision, that picture behind you, his vision for that school, that students like yourself and I would go out and have an impact in the world. I think I've talked about that a little bit on our show in previous episodes, but that's where it all started. So it's fun to have you as a guest because we've had a friendship for many years, and I admire you deeply and respect you and look up to you. And in Hawaii, we call it talking story. I hope that we can talk story today. We can talanoa today, which is having a conversation and dialogue with one another on a very broad topic that hopefully we'll get more specific examples into of conflict across cultures and solutions to helping people maybe move through conflict, even though sometimes it's difficult, that seem to be consistent and have worked even indigenously, things that help us move through it, so that listeners when there's 100% chance that all of us right now are experiencing conflict in one way or another. It's all around us. But the whole point is, if you're watching or listening to this, and even if you get a little segment of this, that you can feel like you have a new tool to help you move forward, or new perspective to help you move forward and work through conflict. So that's what we're going to get into today. Again, David, you have a rich background working in conflict, and not just teaching academically, but actually engaging in it yourself. So you have professional experience, academic experience. Please introduce yourself a little bit more, and we'll keep rolling.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for that amazing introduction. I don't know if that's deserved, but yeah, as you said, Chris and I go way back. I employed his expert services as a student on my senior project. I wanted to look at sports and the possibility of that getting in the context that we're in here in Laie, where a lot of our sports people in the high school level were not getting the opportunities that they should have got because of grades and education, right? And so I recruited some of these star athletes, Chris being one of them, who were the stars of the soccer team when he was playing here, to come in and talk about how they did it and got to the next level, right? So it was a great project, and if I can say so myself, but then Chris came and took over and obviously took it to new heights. One thing in the introduction that Chris didn't mention is that this picture at the back here was, a man of multi-talents. Chris painted this, and this is hung in the office of the kind of the lead or the director of the McKay Center's office right throughout the duration of our program. And so it continues to stay here. And, every time I look at this picture, obviously bringing back memories of Chris, but also just thinking about David McKay, whose name, was at the center of our mission, was at the name on our center, and its vision for bringing peace to the different contexts in our different parts of the world. So again, Chris, thanks for the picture. And there's been multiple copies that have been asked of us, and it hangs in different offices around the world, you can say. Yeah. And then one hangs in Michael's office also. So, all of our peace building faculty have it in there, because a lot of times we say, hey, if there was a guy that we have to be accountable to about his mission and about the center,
Right
David
there.
McKay, right? Awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, just a little bit of my professional background. I came to school here after graduation. I went back to I'm from Fiji. I'm of mixed Fijian, Samoan, and American descent. And so after graduation, I went back to Fiji. And kind of difficult looking for finding work, and so I went to education. In the middle of my master's program, I got offered work at an organization called Save the Children. I worked there for a couple of years as a media and fundraising officer. And my main job was kind of trying to change the narrative in the media space, communicate what we at the organization were doing at the grassroots, at the mid-tier level, at the national level. Afterwards, and I moved into an organization called the Pacific Center for Peacebuilding, which, as it states, did a lot of peacebuilding work in the Pacific. A lot of my work took me into grassroots communities, doing a lot of peacebuilding work there, teaching people how to conflict analysis skills, how to more peacebuilding skills that they can employ in their different spaces. Working with different, if you know Fiji a little bit, our main two ethnic groups are our Fiji Indians and the Itauke, or the indigenous Fijians, and there's been conflict over our young history. Between these two major groups, I was fortunate to be able to work in these different spaces, bring them together at a national dialogue level and work in those spaces also. Anyway, coming back here to BYU Hawaii and teaching, and being, blessed with the opportunity to share what I've gained from that space and what I've gained from the academic space with students now. Is something that I love doing every day. And obviously the academic space and what I've learned in this space has impacted the work that I do when I go back and try to give back in that professional space. I try to do this every year because I recognize that it needs to be done, especially if conflict is ever it's ongoing, and if we try to create cultures of peace where people can be agents of change towards making peace and towards conflict, towards transformation at their level, that's the best thing you can do. It's almost like giving, like, the popular, I don't know what it's called, phrase where you give a man don't have to, it's good to teach them, but instead of giving the fish, you teach them how to fish, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so as much as possible, I try and involve myself in work at the grassroots level, knowing, like I said, that it influences my work in the academic space and vice versa.
And, speaking of which, and kind of getting into some of the topic today, if we want to talk about conflict and peace building, those are pretty broad topics, so we'll define it as we go. But again, I'll make the statement at the beginning, like all of us have conflict in our life, and all of us in some way desire peace, whether we call it that or not. I think it's something that we all inherently want to experience. So what got you into all of this, Like back when you were hooping it up, what did you think you'd be doing this at this point in your life? Like, what led you on this path?
That's a great question. So I'm going to take it all the way back to when I was a student here. Chad Ford was our peace building kind of lead, the main professor, and I had an afternoon class that I had to take. And I said, "Oh, Chad Ford, light bulbs, ESPN, NBA, basketball, and let me take the class. Let's see what's up." Didn't even know it was about peace building. Well, the title was intercultural peace building, but I thought, man, this guy's gonna definitely tie it to basketball somehow. Right throughout that 3-month semester, nothing about basketball, nothing about NBA. Even when I'd go up to him after class and say, "Hey, how's the," we'd talk about peace building kind of thing. And along the way, I kind of fell in love with peace building. I recognized, like you said, that I had conflicts in my own life, and that the space that I was brought up in Fiji, the context, there was, definitely conflicts that needed to be addressed there. And I also wanted to be in a small sort of way, like an instrument, to be able to help some of the conflicts that were in my family, my community, and nationally in Fiji. I thought, what better place to start than back home in Fiji before going out somewhere else, right? And so, I picked up at that time, the certificate, the intercultural peace building certificate, and ran with it, completed it. Was fortunate, and when I went back to Fiji, that's what I did. I wanted to look for something in peace building. I studied psychology, and so they paired well together. But I went back and I worked in the peace building space and got as much experience as possible. Was able to complete my master's, and then be invited to come back here as like an adjunct faculty, and along the way, kind of, I'm at the tail end of my PhD. You said this at the start, you looked up to me. I definitely looked up to you in the way that you completed your PhD, and so I'm on that track now to follow in those their footsteps too, right?
Yeah. Well, I think it's this the world that we've gotten ourselves into, and being curious about conflict and trying to bridge divides and bring peace into communities or people or families, organizations. I don't think it's very common. So I always like to know, why people got into it. And the reason why you and I, and even any other student that's gone through will always have some kind of camaraderie is because of, the vision of the school and the sort of the intentionality of bringing peace, to the world, and not the, as Chad would always say, the holding hands, singing Kumbaya type of peace. That's probably great too, but we're talking about people that are in desperate need of transformation in their life and their relationships. And that's a lot of people. I would say all of us, and from my experience working with different leaders and organizations and groups, everybody is in need of transformation in one way or another. And conflict is just such a barrier to get there, but it could also be the secret, as you know. I mean, it could also be the thing that unlocks the potential. So I hope you keep coming back to your background, because when we're talking about conflict in the Pacific and with these indigenous lenses, I know that, I look at you and I think of this as somebody who I consider an expert with those perspectives, and not just because you're from there, but because you've studied there. That's what your academic work has been around, your professional practical work. You get to work with students from all over the world, all over the Pacific, Asia region, other parts of the globe. So you've had this incredible opportunity to stare face to face with these students, these people that have a world of experiences and conflict that they've gone through, and to find the common threads, and we'll call it maybe the root or the heart of conflicts. Kind of the discussion today, maybe a two-parter, right? The first part is, what are those the common root or the common thread, common heart of conflict, of why it starts and what it feels like for people, and then maybe some of the solutions, even indigenously, that have still lasted to today that we can learn from. So let's take on that first piece. So as you're in your experience studying and working in conflict and working with people from all over, what have you found as the common thread through it all, the root or the heart of conflict from your perspective?
Yeah, just from the experiences that I've had and the study that I've done, what I found answering your question there is that I think that in a lot of ways people, I don't want to bring in Maslow's hierarchy, but I think in a lot of ways people want their needs met, and I think when these needs aren't met, there's going to be conflict. I think people generally want to be understood, want to be recognized for who they are and their identity and what they bring to the table. So I think these, I would start off with those main elements, answering that question about, what's at the heart of conflict and the commonalities that people have. And let me give you a quick example of this. Like, we did a lot of work as an NGO, in different NGOs and different grassroots communities in Fiji. And it's just something that NGOs have to learn too. And I found this in my space, and we were being educated, right? We would go in there and say, hey, let's teach you about peace building. Let's teach you about how to address conflicts that may come up. But we were continuously told at the time, like, how can you, and this is something that was our blind spots. We were going in there with great PowerPoint presentation, great movies, and things of that sort. These grassroots communities don't have continuous electricity, don't have running water, don't have access to healthcare, don't have access to amenities that we would take for granted sometimes. And so I found out that at that juncture, that addressing conflict and addressing the need is addressing the needs. Okay, we have to find a way. Maybe we can't do that as an NGO, but we can bring the necessary people in to talk to these individuals about how do I get power to my village, right? Yeah. How do I get water, clean water to this place? How do I get access healthcare or just a health center down the road, right? And so working in this NGO space kind of brought that realization to me. And also it was like, we go to certain communities, you have to recognize, we also have to learn to recognize, it was not on our terms, but also on the people that are stakeholders, those that we wanted to teach. We'd go in a Fiji Indian community, and traditionally these Indo-Fijian communities were involved with sugarcane cutting. And so we'd go and organize a workshop or training, and nobody would show up. Literally, there'd be 3 or 4 people that show up, and that was it, right? We found out, okay, it's cane cutting season. The whole family is supposed to be there helping with the cane, because that means more production, that means more cane cut, that means more money for the family. And so they won't come to our workshops because this is more important. Yeah. We do anything, we didn't realize after 3 o'clock, because that's when children came home from school. Their parents, usually because of a collectivistic society, were there taking care of them. And so nobody would show up. If they would show up, they'd have their children in tow, and we'd get flustered because we can't teach them this, because the children are kind of playing around, right? And so we have to be aware of these things. So which means, we have to really try to understand the people that we were working with. And as we responded to these individuals on the ground, learning for us is sometimes it's that all-knowing. We have the skills, we have the experience. I've got a couple of degrees in my pocket. I know everything. A lot of it was learning at that level to work with individuals. And giving them the space to share that, to create that talanoa, to create that that dialogue, so that we can say, okay, what works for you, and let's see what works for us, and we can communicate on that aspect.
Yeah, there's a lot packed in there. So I have some questions and some thoughts, because it's a great example. Starting with essentially everybody has different needs, different dynamics. They might stem from similar human needs that we have, identity, freedom, food, water, things of that nature, but they're going to be manifest differently. One thought that I've learned over time in doing, we'll call it peace building work and working in conflict, is that as a third party, let's say, folks like you and I that are, contracted or are desiring to go and help out as a third party, right? The third side sort of a thing, is I've learned that one of the greatest skill sets we can have is learning how to learn,
I agree.
just to learn how to learn, because everything's going to look different. The same solution isn't going to work. And to learn about the people and the culture in our curriculum, in groundwork, we call it the soil work, right? Like if I want to get to the root of the weed, and there's another piece to this that you've mentioned, is there's layers to conflict. So not every conflict is the same, and there's layers to it. And typically the deeper we go into the soil, that's deeper the root. And sometimes those roots are the most thin and precious, and if you're too aggressive, it can break them, and then you leave a remnant there, and then it could just regrow. And so like the soil is so important to understand the surrounding soil before we get into the root of the weed, because we certainly can't just chop it off at the top. I mean, that's probably the most common approach that people take, but that's never the full story. Like what we see on the surface is never the full story. It's like Chad's iceberg, the iceberg's biggest at the bottom. Same thing with a weed. Like the thing at the top is not the actual conflict. It's what Yuri and Chad call the position. It might be the positions, but the deep below where the needs and values and world views are. So talk to me about how you've kind of learned to put on those lenses of, okay, there's layers to this conflict. And then how do you go about, you mentioned they have all these dynamics going on. They're working in the sugar fields, or this is the time when family comes, and there's all these different dynamics. So what's your approach to understanding the soil? What do you do? When it comes to on the ground, how do you address that? Nobody's showing up to these workshops. Nobody's showing up to the things we're trying to do. What's the next step?
Yeah, definitely. I think the big part of it that we had to do was to have a recognition that, I love what you said about learn how to learn. There needs to be a recognition that there's expertise on the ground with these stakeholders. They may have lived in the conflict longer. They definitely have some ideas on how to get out of this conflict, how to address it. This might not be collectively agreed upon, but they have ideas that they can bring to the table, right? One of the things that we talked about in the NGO space is we need to step back and kind of learn to analyze our analysis. This brings us to the space where we can try to recognize these blind spots, and how we can adapt. And so it went from, for example, with Fiji is a very patriarchal society, and I don't know if this may have some connections to. It may have some connections to how we do maybe training nowadays in our own individual spaces, even outside of Fiji, right? So let me give you this quick example with regards to with Fiji being a patriarchal society. It transitioned from, it started from, when you go into traditional settings, even settings that are more urban settings, 90% of people at the table that are at the workshop or the training, a lot of times in Fiji, maybe in other spaces, are male, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I will speak to Fiji, and maybe we can see if we can make connections to other spaces. At a particular point in time, it was recognized that the woman's space, and and if you're watching this, I'm just the messenger here. Don't crucify me for this, right? The woman's place was in the kitchen, right? Provided for the meals, provided for the morning tea. We are a British society: morning tea, afternoon tea, lunch, supper that followed. So this was kind of the recognized roles. It transitioned to let's have women at the table.
Yeah.
So there was representation. Now it's transitioned into say, okay, now we need to not only have them at the table, but encouraging spaces for them to participate and make decisions.
Mm-hmm.
And so this kind of recognition and trying to create those spaces was something that we had to go through. Now we realize, and I'm working with organizations to say, hey, the Pacific Center for Peacebuilding, I worked with them in December 2023, last December, prepared a whole program for him, and they said, you know what, we're just going to create a space primarily for our women. because
Yeah.
there may be some cultural, there may be some patriarchal things that stop them or hinder them from expressing themselves in a way that they want to share truth, talk story. And so I was involved in that process. And it took, I don't want to say I created a whole curriculum, but I added to it. And it took, I don't want to say because I'm proud or anything of that sort, but I had to realize that I can't go into that space. Even though I
Yeah.
create, even though I work with them, even though I said this is the steps you need to follow, because that space is a safe space for women. And this, and for them to share, for them to talk story, and for them to come up with solutions that fit them. Obviously, they may have different opinions, but providing that space, I think, is starting to become a big part of not only the peace building and the work that I'm doing in the field, but also I try to create that in the classroom also, because I recognize there are people from different cultures that the way that they learn and the way they engage in class is different. Some students are more so, if you're from, from parts of the Pacific, all of your education, I don't want to say bank, like Pearl of Ferry will say, your banking education, and I as the teacher am the conduit of all knowledge, and what I say to other spaces where they're engaging a lot of time. So as an academic, and this, we have to balance these types of learning from our students. And so just the recognition of stepping back and learning how to learn, recognizing the expertise that are already in the space and providing that space, the right space at the right time for them to be able to engage in a safe way, if that makes sense.
No, this is great, because whether, wherever the conflict is in our life, if we're a participant, a party, we're partisan to it, or nonpartisan, and we're a third party, these are helpful things to know, right? The first is that we've been discussing is conflict. It's going to have similar roots, but they're going to look different for everybody. But for me, it simplifies it knowing that they're coming from the same sort of need or something that's been threatened or taken away, right? Like people fight because they fight, or they run because something important has been threatened or taken away or harmed, right? Whether it's identity, freedom, like basics like food and water, things that we've already talked about. So that simplifies it, but then it gets more complicated because that's going to look different. So that's when we need to put on the sort of learning to learn hat, is what I'm hearing, and I think that's critical. Is there's so much here that I don't understand, and so I need to be learning constantly. And that's a skill set, it's not something that you can just do overnight. And I think that any peace builder has to learn that, whether they're naturally gifted at it or they have to learn it the hard way, maybe like me, and still struggle with it. We got to learn to learn, and to know that conflict has layers, and there's going to be different learning along the way. There's no one size fits all. But then you said it last too, of creating safe spaces for people. Those could be physical or emotional, spiritual, mental even. They don't always have to be this physical space, but that's critically important. I could have said, 10 years ago that, oh yeah, that's what we learn in peace building, create safe spaces. But I didn't even fully appreciate it until, now I'm even my research I've done here on these conditions for transformation, one of them is creating safe space for people, and not like what it means really in my research has been a place where people can learn together and practice together.
Exactly.
It's not like, oh no, you're so safe, nothing ever bad will happen to you. That has its place in conflict. But what I think is more important is a place where people can learn and grow together, and even push the status quo, right? Even say things can be better than this, and then fail forward. Like, we don't always have a space. I always tell people, we learn as little kids, playing sports. When we're little, you show up to practice. The whole point is to fail, right? You're going to miss a bunch of shots, and that's okay. That's why you come to practice. But then for some reason we become adults and we think, no more mistakes. If you screw up, you're in trouble. And we don't have those spaces anymore. And so we need those spaces in our communities, in our families, in our organizations, where we can mess up, and it's okay, because that's what the space is for. Like, we come to this space to talanoa, to have conversation, to not be perfect, and it's okay, because we can't always, we get punished on the outside, but where's those spaces now?
Definitely, and I agree with that. I mean, I think these spaces, and again, like you said, they're not only just the physical states, but they're emotional, spiritual, these other factors that are important, help us as peace builders, as individuals, not fall into the trap of addressing the symptoms of the conflict. Because in these spaces, we like you're talking about, the symptoms are manifested, but we want to get to the root cause. And these are delicate things. People don't want to bring this out. People don't want to talk about it, right? But I think in these spaces, for example, in these spaces, this can be an opportunity for individuals who are like-minded, who learn and practice together, like you stated, to be able to push the status quo. So an example is, at the McKay Center, I supervise, and we've both been field directors. I supervise a group of field directors who are kind of our senior students that really run the activities for the McKay Center. A lot of times, unbeknownst to me, and I'm learning also, I create conflict when I go into this space and dictate things, and I try to address the conflict, the symptoms of the conflict that I see. What I've tried to learn, and it's an ongoing process, is to step back and allow these individuals an opportunity they're working in the same space, but these are gifted students. I have to give them, they're educated, they're capable of doing it, and give them that opportunity, that space to be able to address it, learn from it, and practice. And they, once they get this idea of how to address these symptoms, maybe that's a conversation that we can have afterwards. But coming out from that space, there's Talanoa that's already had that space. And so that's what we try to also do in the field. Let's have the women's group of the village, who are a very important group, come together and talk about issues that relate to them and conflict, and then we'll bring them together with our other groups in the village, right? And so I try to practice that. Again, I've seen a lot of improvement, and again, this is something for me as a leader to continuously, like you said, learn how to learn.
What would you say to somebody listening to us right now that, their conflict they're experiencing, let's say it's fairly interpersonal, right? Let's say it's a conflict with a family member, a friend, or a colleague. We've been in those conflicts where you think about it all the time. It eats at you. It's annoying. It causes your blood to boil. And what do we do there? Like, the last thing we want to do is actually learn more about them.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Last thing we want to do is try to understand how their side. The last thing we want is to think about as a safe space. We don't feel safe with them, right? So we think, it's their fault. So what do we do in those moments, where we're in it and we're experiencing it? What's the first that you've seen, one of the first couple of steps that we can take to kind of start to help us get out of it? Because, we can't change the other person. That's what we want to do, but we can't. So what do we do?
That's a really good question. Again, we've seen this many times, not only in classroom, but in spaces that I work with at the NGO level. We're trying to bring together communities, groups of people that have conflict, and usually the people that are, I don't want to say all the time, but the people that are all geared up to come are those that ready to fight, ready to be competitive. I'm going to say what I need to say there, then leave. And that situations can be beneficial, but also those kind of situations can continually turn up the heat on conflict, right? Well, the easy answer is, let me start with this, is to, try as much as possible to decide your pride, the things that are holding you back from going to meet this person. But that's the easy answer, right? Because it's difficult. We're passionate about a thing. We're passionate about what we feel. Or maybe our identity is being hurt, like you talked about. Maybe there's some boundaries that have been crossed. And one thing that I try to use, I'm not saying this is the answer, this is the 1-2 step. In Fiji we have, you've been alluding to this right through, right? We have Talanoa, and that's just and another one called Veibosaki Yang,
Okay.
And so let me explain that. Talanoa is, as you know, it's kind of a discussion. It's an open-end discussion. It's kind of wherever the wind goes, your conversation will go in that particular way, right? So you can be starting off talking about the U.S. soccer team, and then you move into the NBA, and then you move to conflict resolution. That's Talanoa. That Talanoa allows you to, in a lot of ways, gauge the interests. You could gauge the how people are in certain situations, what they're interested in, and how you can possibly relate to them through the conversation, right? Vevosakiyanga in the Fijian context is more in-depth conversation. It's usually not in a group format. It's usually, if it's in a group, it's between 1, 2 people, it's 3 people at the most. It's smaller, it's more in-depth. The conversation comes in and there's a set topic that you're going to be talking about. For example, why aren't we having the relationship that we should be having as colleagues in this workspace? And so, but that comes at the end of a talanoa session that people can have in these different spaces.
Yeah.
And if I involve myself in a talanoa session with this other individual, I learn how they are. If they're forthwith, I am privy to them. I build a relationship. But this Vosaki session is, we've been going through these things. This is what I feel that hindering me from moving forward in this relationship, in this work relationship. It's that opportunity to clear the air. But this may have to come after a couple of talanoa sessions.
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes sense. Sorry.
No, it makes perfect sense, And of course, I wasn't familiar with that Fijian term. Say it again.
Vevosakiyanga.
Vevosakiyanga.
That's it.
Vevosakiyanga. Obviously, I'm really familiar with talanoa, and because we talk about that in Hawaii a lot and use that term. So what I like about this, it makes total sense to me, right? It's building relationship with people, listening and learning, like we've talked about, and then the intentionality of going deep and kind of skipping ahead now to talking. We can come back to this. I'm just like forecasting a piece here, and I know we only have a few more minutes left, but the idea of what indigenous practices can we still apply today? I mean, you've named a couple. Overarching, no matter where we're at or where we come from, I've found just through my own observation and experience, but then actually conducting our research, is that having a common language is so important. And not just like, the obvious one is the same actual language, English, Fijian, right? I'm not talking necessarily about that. I'm talking about words and terms that mean something specific that people can quickly understand, Like for us, how we've tried to create a common language in our community amongst leaders is through our rooted curriculum. If we all share this language, we can talk about conflict so much quicker. We can talk about culture so much quicker. We've done it today because part of our curriculum is weeds, getting to the root of weeds. Most people, I would say, and maybe not all, get that analogy really quickly so we can have a specific conversation. And now I get to see leaders. I go to community gatherings where before they would have 100 different ways to talk about something. Now they can say, look, this is a soil and we have to address the soil. And everybody's like, yeah, you're right. Before they would have, probably 8 different ways to describe the problem, and they would disagree on just the way they would describe it, not even on the actual problem itself. So that's what I'm hearing as well from what you're sharing. So I think those are great specific examples, but you're also alluding to having a common language in conflict is important. And if I'm in the conflict with you and you with me, if we want to ever work through it, we have to sort of have a common language. And this is what I've discovered about common language, and I might be wrong, but this is just kind of Chris's assessment, is common language. If we want to know what the common language is of ourself and of other people, I found that when the way we think about and describe the best moments of our life and the very worst, that's where our common language is, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, I'll just use myself as an example. Like when things are going really well, I usually describe that in terms, like I make it spiritual, I talk about God, or I talk about the spirit or what have you, of why things are so good, right? Like prayer, you name it. I do the same when things are really bad. Like I rely on that language. And so common language helps us through those extremes, I think, make sense of them, but it also impacts everything in between. So when we're working in a conflict or we're with somebody, when I'm listening and learning to them, I'm trying to find out what is their common language? How do they describe the greatest moments of their life? And how do they describe when things are really difficult? That's going to give me insight into their language of how they describe and make sense of the world. Now I know how to sort of interact and relate to them. Find that common ground that we share. We don't need to hold our own ground in conflict, which we typically think we should do. We actually share the same ground. We're on the same ground together. If you dig deep enough, we're all on the same ground. So anyways, I'll just let you respond to that. But those are some of my thoughts that go through my mind as you're sharing.
No, that's thank you for that, because that's what I had down with regards to as part of building I'm pulling from I'm trying to put together some articles here where if creating a culture of peace, one of the main things that you have to do is to have a common language.
Yeah.
And a lot of times this language, and vice versa, has to be rooted in common values, right? And we know this as we come into the peace building program. Our common language that we've learned over a lot of times has been Arbinger. It's moved now to dangerous love. That has been the common language right throughout our program. People talking about collusion, I know what that means. Talking about a hearted war, I know what that means. Dangerous love, we know that, right? And I try to create that and listen for that, as you said, when I go into mediation, when I go into trainings, I try to study these organizations. What's the language of the organization? And if a culture shift is needed, that language should be something that's collectively generated by the people that are going to be in that language in that space. It's not me and I know I'm preaching to the choir. It's not me as an outside consultant to come in and say, everybody's going to speak Fijian. That's going to be your language, right? The stakeholders in these different spaces, the people that work it, that are going to learn and practice it, need to come and find that common ground and find that language that they can work with, because language creates understanding. It's, like you said, commonality, brings respect. And if you're able to better articulate these things, the chances for peace, the chances to work together more effectively, the chances that you get along with the people that you're working with. I don't want to say this working with, but in other relationships in your life, I think it's just much more better, much more. There's an opportunity, much more for success.
Yeah. No, and you had me think of a couple examples. The second, I think, can lead into indigenous practices, part of the conversation I wanted to have. But the first is, I think, a great example with something that we both are familiar with and care about, and led by a person that we both love, with Seamus and the work at PCC, and what started with Chad, and I was able to help with a lot of that, years ago, when first it was like, well, let's just teach the villages in the PCC Arbinger, and what we found out, and it started with the Maori village and the proverb, the He Tangata proverb, where we realized, again, the hard way of learning to learn, that why are we trying to force this other language on them? They have their own that's very close and important to them in their own language, in their own culture, their own history. And then that spread, with the work Seamus did throughout the entire PCC with, pulling the language that was important to them and making it maybe rooted in the same principles to something like Arbinger or all these other ideas out there, but it became personal and real for them. So then people could get behind it. They understood it. It resonated quickly. I think that's a great example of exactly what you just said, right? Where there's a language and there's things to help people to kind of break through those barriers that we learn through talanoa, not just the literal talanoa, like we're sitting down having a conversation, but just the idea of my metaphorically doing the talanoa right now in my work that I'm engaging in. Or if I'm the one in conflict, can I start to think that way and just be a little more curious than I was before and pay attention a little bit more? So that was one example that I thought was good. But another one, at least that I've had to learn kind of the hard way, and it took years to work through this, was I go into an organization, I shouldn't start forcing my own language on them. So what did I do? I got curious about people's vision and mission statements, their own values. Okay, tell me about your values. Great. So then I knew how to connect with them. Okay, great. Now we have a language. But then the challenge was when we started doing this community-wide peace building, and maybe you can relate to this, is there's not really a common language. And I'll be honest, because I'm from the Western culture, I know it well. My dad's obviously from the Philippines, but I grew up in the States. So I know how people talk about things, and I get it. And in the professional sort of leadership world, I found this, and hopefully nobody, punishes me for this. But I discovered this, is that the language that exists there now isn't good enough. It doesn't work. The handshake, and you heard me talk a little bit about this when I was out in Hawaii. The handshake doesn't work. It doesn't, it works for us doing business, but it doesn't work to get to the heart of conflict. You can't just talk about love in West. It means something different to everybody else. I think that's one of the motivations why Chad wrote Dangerous Love, because love's the same word we use for 1,000 different things. So you can't just say, well, you should love each other. Because for some people, they're like, whoa, we're not talking about love here. You can't, in island culture, like there's different expectations and there's different relationships. The way that my dad cares for family or the elderly or conducts himself in business is different than they do in the West. And so in the West, it's like strict barrier. Don't bring personal and home, like don't do it. And so there's all these things I kept running into at the community level when there wasn't a on the wall written set of values and norms and a vision statement to rely on. It was like, well, then how do we create it? And I came to the harsh reality that what exists, I felt, and I still sort of believe, it just wasn't good enough. Like it wasn't going to get us to the heart of conflict in the way that I at least felt was possible. And it took me, years to figure out how to break through that barrier, if that makes sense. And one of the things that helped was indigenous practices, right? Where I remembered, the Hongi and the significance of the Hongi. I learned that, it's not just the Maori culture, obviously lots of island cultures. In the Philippines even, it's called ongo, right? So I started to rely on something that was around for a lot longer than me or, my community, and to use as a talking point or at least a language and ultimately an actual gesture that, to my surprise, multiple leaders have done with each other here. It's been amazing to help us break through that. And it worked. And it has worked, and it is working. And so that's kind of my segue into this next topic, but also a bit of my frustration I found along the way is, and maybe some people feel that right now, what I currently have isn't working, and it's not good enough, in some way. It's just not. I was just working with the sheriff of our county the other day. He was elected. This was maybe a couple weeks ago. He was sharing a story with me. He was elected, and he's not a touchy-feely guy at all. Like, he didn't grow up with, he said, I didn't grow up with my parents. Like, we didn't say we loved each other a lot. We didn't, hug each other, touch each other a whole lot. Which for you and I, dude, in the islands, you're kissing each other's cheeks, hugging, it's normal, right? For him, he's like, no, I don't touch it. Like, it's just totally outside of it. And there's a lot of people, I'd say, in American Western culture that are the same. Like, I've met a lot of people like that. They don't, we don't, no physical touch, that's fluffy, that's soft, we don't do it. But then he said, I became elected and I realized when I started working with the SWAT guys, like the SWAT, the SWAT team, they are the most touchy guys I've ever met. Like, they hug each other for everything. Everything is big hugs and they say, I love you all the time. And so he's even had to learn, in order to get along with my SWAT guys who are important people in my, in our department, I have to be that way. And so he's adapted and he's had to learn we hug each other when I'm with the SWAT guys. We say we love each other. That's just what they do. He's like, that's the culture that's there. But he also he made this realization that, the same that I did is that sometimes in certain cultures, specifically here in the West, I found that when we're trying to get to transformation and we're really trying to transform something, what currently exists in the common language out there, we'll just label it as that. It's in a lot of ways it wasn't good enough. And I tried for 3-4 years trying to teach and the blah, 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 and all these things and never really seeing any true results. But then bringing in an indigenous practice, I'll be honest, if I had to put it down to one thing that made the difference, it was introducing that, just the idea of it, David. That's the power that I think it has, is just the idea of a simple indigenous practice that might be normal to people from the islands. It just cut through all these barriers for people here of now I know what you're talking about. Now I get it. Now I feel it. So I'm going to stop there because I've been rambling, but
no, that made a lot of great points there, Chris. I think, just starting off, I think that you say your sheriff, is that your sheriff friend? It sounds like he learned the SWAT language, right? was able to go into it, right? I think that, and this is, maybe I'll let's the gospel corner, David. I think that when I teach these indigenous practices, I teach it from a space that I'm almost sharing something that's sacred to me, right? And there's a strong connection to that within my own identity.
Yes.
And I think there's a recognition. I think there's there's aspects of that in cultures that may not be traditional. And I think what I've tried to do was try to, in some way or form, try to find something that our friends that may not be, that don't have this, have a strong sense of connection to. And so it may be the Hongi and maybe the Talanoa and maybe these other, Iafonga and Bulumbulu, which are different indigenous cultural practices. Maybe that brings back something to that connects with our individuals. Like you said, you're talking about how CEOs are doing it, the people that go through your training are recognizing the impact of that. I think that, I think showing them and allowing them to see that these traditions that have lasted over long, like you said when you came and visited us here, right? It's been here before I came, thousands of years. It's going to be still here when I'm gone, right? This way of interacting, right? I think it can be done. I think that there needs to be an openness to it. I think there needs to be work on not only implementers like yourself and me, but also the people that we're working with to allow themselves to be able to connect with these different things. Like we say in Hawaii, when you walk into different houses, you see the different slippers there because they take it off. Hey, just try it on, right? I'm not saying steal it, but if you like it, maybe go buy a pair for you, right? Try it on. It may work for you and you and your team, yourself. But I can definitely see where you're coming from with regards to like these different languages, and I think that's where the cycle comes in with. If I'm working in a space in Fiji, and I'm trying to create a culture along with language that I can better articulate myself, better understand individuals, and I've talked about it where it's connected to values and principles, these foundational elements. I am pretty sure that other cultures, other people that I'm going to be working with, maybe articulating themselves in their own language, maybe creating a culture, but there should be I'm 95% certain that there are foundational commonalities. And so that's where language and values can come into place in peacebuilding, from my perspective, right? I don't know. I don't want to come up as I'm teaching and professing here, but from my perspective, that also has worked in the spaces that I've been in.
Yeah, no, and that's brilliant and great insight. And you first said it and this led me to another thought, right? Because I agree with you. Like when I talk about any sort of cultural or indigenous custom that's near and dear to me, I talk about it as if it's sacred, like I talk about it like this is something precious. And I think that sends a message to anybody that's listening when you're they feel it, right? And they sort of respect it and at least they're trying to be intentional in honoring it. It would be different if I'm like, so I read this thing in a book, in the islands, they put their faces together. Like it wouldn't be the same, but it's personal. And it's sacred to me, right? And so that leads to another piece of, because I had, and I'm just speaking from my own experience here, I've had a few leaders when we were talking about, hey, we want to grow what we're doing to other communities. They kept asking me, and I didn't fully appreciate it in the moment. Like this was maybe 2-3 years ago. They're like, but Chris, how are you going to replicate you? And I'm like, what do you mean replicate me? Like our curriculum and our stuff, it'll work other places. They're like, no, but you as the deliverer has been the difference. And I'm like, no, it's not. It's not about me. I'm trying to like be humble. It's not about me. They're like, no, you don't understand. You are a key piece in this because the way you talk about what you teach, somebody else can't do that like you do it. And I had this realization that wasn't of like arrogance or pride. It was just of that. And this goes to a key element for anybody listening right now is you are the solution, right?
Yeah.
We are the solution. And so when we're in conflict or we're trying to make change or make a difference, we become a key instrument in that process because we make things sacred. We make things special. We make things important. And I wrote an article not too long ago about Hongi and Ongo and sharing the breath of life. And I wrote it, trying to show as much respect as I can for my culture and others' cultures. But I had a couple comments and somebody was like, you talking about that just makes me really uncomfortable. Like the thought of putting my face up to somebody else's is really uncomfortable. And I create space and learn. I wasn't mad. I'm like, you're completely right. This isn't, it's not for a lot of cultures. It's totally uncomfortable, right? But again, it led me back to the same resolve that when we're in conflict, we are a part of the solution. It's not some outside element. Our engagement and our delivery of actions, our behaviors, our thoughts, our language become part of the solution itself because it's us that's doing it, which makes conflict really cool and powerful, but also, man, you're telling me every conflict's going to be different because people are different, and they're going to be the solution. That makes it really difficult to get to the heart of it, because you can't transform it unless the person is bought into that idea in some way, shape, or form. Like, they have to feel it and they have to want it. And that's the hard part, I think, is you can't force that on anybody. We can just do it ourselves, you know.
I agree with that. That's the paradox. Like, the people, we are the part of the solution, but a lot of times the part of it, there's different people. There's different approaches, and there's some people might say, well, David is the problem. That's why we have a conflict, right? But just imagine an organization or a team that is grounded by something as much as you, Chris, yourself, value your culture, right? Their company culture is in such a place where they value it to such an extent that it's embedded. There's ownership, there's accountability. I think something a company with different individuals that have a unique outlook based on this connection to their culture. I think will create individuals and people that work in that space, or that live in that space, or that occupy that space, are more conducive to creating conditions of peace. Change agents, people that see themselves as the solution and not necessarily the conflict all the time. Think about, and you were familiar with both of them with the sports team, the All Blacks, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not saying, hey, before every meeting, let's stand up and say, do the haka together. But in the game, there's mana, there's power there when they get up and they do this cultural ritual, they do the haka, then they get into the game. There needs to be a more of a metaphorical haka that we do in our different spaces to connect us to this, what grounds us as individuals, and to connect us to other individuals in the space, so that we can be better, help others be better also.
Yeah, and that's the invitation, I think, and why indigenous practices can be applied modernly, right? It's not the actual, maybe it's not the actual act or ritual itself, but it's learning what it did. Because I always have to think about it this way, in indigenous times, it wasn't an indigenous practice at that time, it was just how they did it.
Yeah.
It was the way they did it. They didn't think about it indigenously. It was just the way of life. It was how they did it. And our interpretation or history of it, oral or written, learning about it and practicing it in our families or whatever, like the gesture, an example in the Philippines is Mano Po. And maybe you've had Filipino students tell you about it, or you've learned about it, but you take the hand of somebody else, typically an elder, and you place it on your forehead. And I grew up doing that as okay, this is just getting Lola's blessing. This is just getting an elder's blessing. And then the older I get, the more I learn about my culture, and I realize, well, indigenously, the head was the most sacred part of the body. And there's Filipino headhunters that are called. And you'd think it sounds really gruesome, they would take the head of their enemies. But they took it because it was the most sacred part. They would bring it back to their village and put it in a sacred place that you would never go to or touch. But they believed that the mana, the energy from their enemies, they respected them by, we're taking the most sacred part from you. And that is the most sacred part of our body. So now, when I think about the gesture itself, it's not just, I'm getting blessing from Lola. It's no, this is the transfer of the mana from my elder to me, to the most sacred part of my body, right? And so I didn't think about that or know that as a kid, but now kind of tracing back, I understand, okay, this is the significance of it. But my point being is, of how we can apply these sort of practices now is, maybe we're not going to do Mano Po when we meet each other, right? And every time I'm with a new group, I typically talk about Mano Po, and I say, look, this is your organization, this is your community. I'm not from here, I'm not in your organization, I'm a guest. So I Mano Po with each of you to show you my respect. I'm not actually going around and doing it. I'm just saying I Mano Po with you so that they understand the significance and they can feel that I'm trying to be intentional to show my respect to you. And we can do that with a lot of these practices. You don't have to do it. You don't have to do the haka before team meeting to know that. But you can think as an organization, what should we do to help us be motivated for the day, or to take on this new project, or to face this conflict, and turn it in and make it your own. Make your own ritual, make your own practice as an organization. And I've seen a lot of organizations, do things like that. They They come up with their own things. They make up their own silly language of like, we're going to do it's like, this is our blank blank meeting. What do you do there? Oh, well, we do this. Why do you do that? Because it helps us do this. Oh, okay, got it. And they come up with their own ritual. And we can do the same around, conflict of how do we engage with it, especially in an organization, so that there's a process, like, oh, well, we should do this first. We should talanoa. Maybe we don't call it that, but we're going to do this. And so maybe our role is to help translate those things and help people discover what those could be.
I definitely agree with you. And I think maybe, in the Fijian culture, we also, the head is sacred, right? And much along connected to the Filipino culture also, I think. And maybe that's a core, right? That's core to us as leaders, right? If there's the sacredness in the position that we have in leading these different groups, maybe part of our responsibility is to see what's best for the organization and Mano Po, the sharing the knowledge, sharing our wisdom with those that a lot of times we see them as subordinates, and maybe they are, but people that are going to be working for the success of the company, what we're trying, or the space or the team, what we're trying to do also. Which means, hey, what's the best culture that I can possibly create so that everybody that work, that are living, that are in this space can be successful and can contribute to be the solution.
Yeah, that's great. I could keep talking to you for hours, man. We'll have to do part 2 and 3.
Sounds good.
This has been good though. I hate to kind of just end it abruptly, but I feel like I've had a good conversation about where conflict can come from, commonalities, but also sort of the complexities and uniqueness to it, and how to work through it, from a technical standpoint to, more a deeper one. We've talked about these indigenous practices and ways that we can learn from those things and apply them in our own life, our own families, our own organizations. And the nice thing is that all of us have an indigenous culture, no matter where we're from, we have ancestors, we have those that came before us, and they had practices that helped them. Some successful, some not, but we should learn from them, right? And in the Philippines, mana means very similar to in all the islands, but it also can mean, and specifically in my dad's dialect, the word pamana means it literally means your lineage, like what comes before you, and we can learn from our pamana, right? The good and the bad, and we can, again, because that's truth that's lasted throughout time, and then we can apply that in our own lives, all the way down to our own interpersonal conflict. Is we're not alone. We're not the first person in our blood that's ever faced conflict. There's people that have come before. Learn from their mistakes, learn from their successes, because we're creating lineage today. There's going to be those that come after us, and so the link that we are in that chain, I think, is a powerful way to also see it. And the same goes in an organization. There was those before us. There's going to be those after us. And so we're not alone in our conflict, which it feels that way often. It feels lonely and can be, a lot of fear involved. But there's a lot of things we can look to.
Yeah, I love what you said about being indigenous to a space. About the Hawaiian culture where they talk about hanai or being adopted in, right? I am, and then what I've learned at the feet of Kumu here, and we talked about this in my one of the classes that I taught last semester. Indigenous, you can be adopted into different spaces, but the essence of the premise of it is that you have to care about the space. There has to be accountability. You got to be responsible, and you got to want to be in that space, right? So you can definitely be, and I know my course is still here, but we can be indigenous to different spaces that we want to be, but there has to be ownership to be and accountability and responsibility. Malama to be in these spaces.
Honor it.
Definitely.
Getting this tattoo, which is a lot of indigenous motifs on here, and my artist, even though I'm Filipino, he's Filipino, he's telling me his responsibility is like, if I'm going to put these motifs on your body, I want you to represent our culture well, So even in our own cultures, we should take that same responsibility of that I represent something, but certainly when we're adopted into other cultures and other ways of thinking, we should always try to honor what we've learned and who we are. Well, David, man, I love you, man. I appreciate you, and
I love you too.
I hope you know I think of you as a brother, and I really do admire you, and I just know that we'll be lifelong friends, and we'll stay connected in one way or another, and I don't doubt it. So it's just been a privilege to get to know you over the years, and thank you for being in this conversation, this talanoa with me today. I like where it took us.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it's fun.
Thank you, Chris, for the opportunity. Again, always up for a part 2 and part 3. And obviously, this in our Asian and Pacific culture. Aloha and Loloma to your family, to Mackenzie and to the kids. And definitely keep it up.
Okay, brother. Mahalo. Aloha.